Hello everyone, Somber here. In this video I'd like to take a quick look at the changelog for the new version of the Somber Warhammer compilation pack, which is where all of the Warhammer nations for Dominions 5 live. So I'm just going to look at the changelog for that. The new version is 1.5. It will be linked in the description. But before I start, I just thought I'd mention to everyone that I won't be supporting the individual nation mods going forward. It'll just be the compilation pack. It became a bit of a chore to support splitting the individual nations out constantly. So it'll just be this one pack going forward. And I talked to people, and everyone seemed to agree that that's basically what everyone wanted. That it wasn't really necessary to do the individual nations. So I've mentioned them in previous videos, but they're no longer a thing. You just use the compilation pack. Okay, so let's have a look at what we've got in the changelog. This covers a lot of the different nations, starting out with some general changes. Remove the unique tag from various national heroes. This is basically just so that they can go in the Hall of Fame, and there's a few other reasons to do that. It's not a very intrusive change at all. And I added some more square bracketed bits of mechanical information at the end of unit descriptions. I like to put in as much mechanical information as I can that's missing from things. Dominions often can be a little bit vague about things. If it doesn't have icons for certain abilities, it maybe just mentions them as in the flavor, or it doesn't mention them at all. I like to make them explicit, and I put the things that are not lore information and not flavor text, I put them in square brackets at the end of the description. So Bretonnia has only one change, which is that their fort province defense was improved. I mostly did this because I noticed in the Warhammer pop type PD, I'd given them kind of sensible province defense they could get if you have that submod included, and that was actually better than the province defense they were getting in their forts. So now they get more sensible fort province defense, and it's a bit less useless. That's all I changed for them. Everything else for them seemed to be generally okay. Chaos Dwarves, I added a new mechanic to, which is that when Chaos Dwarves own or siege a fort, they pollute the province towards Death 1 if it has neutral or positive growth scales. So you might want to not take growth as the Chaos Dwarves. So before I had given them death recruitment on some of their slaves, and I've removed that now. The slave contracts don't have death recruitment anymore, and there are a few other incentives because death is kind of thematically accurate for Chaos Dwarves because they cause all this pollution and destruction and kind of turn things into wastelands with strip mines and things. And now their forts automatically do that. And any fort that they siege, they start kind of destroying all the landscape around it, pushing it towards death. If you've really got death 2 or 3, this won't do anything at all. If you've got like high positive growth scales, then there'll be a kind of battle back and forth between the death and growth. But overall, it will eventually end up kind of tending towards death 1. So if you take growth 3, it won't be particularly effective in your capital, for instance. You may not want to do that. You may just want to take death 1 instead because of this mechanic. In exchange, forts now give them an extra 10% to their resources. That's kind of a trade-off against the fact they're just polluting everything and strip mining everything. I nerfed Fireglaive infantry a bit. They're now rec limited, so you don't build entire armies of them. There's only a certain number you can build per turn. And the Fireglaive does a bit less damage against single targets, and they're also a bit more expensive. Fireglaives are basically just too good. That was revealed in a recent game where someone was making their armies almost entirely out of Fireglaves, and they were very strong. The Slave Giant was decreasing gold cost because he was a bit too expensive. Basically, people just weren't building them because they were too expensive. I may have to make further changes to them to make them more attractive to people, but for now, it's just this change to the gold cost. Slave contracts don't have death recruitment discount anymore. I've already said that, but there's no death recruitment discount at all in the Chaos Dwarf faction. They do have their Chaos Dwarves don't need to eat. They do like to eat, but they don't need to eat, so they can't starve because they can eat kind of rocks and things. But they also have less severe penalties for death scales, I believe, built into their nation. And then the other thing was I decreased the gold cost of Immortals because this was another unit that wasn't getting built very much and it was just a bit overpriced at 40 gold. They're really good Immortals, but I just reduced their price a bit and they now have halved gold upkeep, a bit like a Sacred, and that's pretty much because I want people to feel that they're able to build this, these kind of elite guys over time and kind of hold them back as a reserve if they need to. But also I want them to, if you halve things upkeep, then when you lose them, it's more painful than if you lost something that had a higher upkeep because the longer you keep them alive for, the more you benefit from the fact they've got half gold upkeep. So it's kind of an incentive to keep Immortals alive as well. For the Dark Elves, I've nerfed the Doomfire Warlocks a bit. They are also rec limited, it's only 2 per turn, and I've increased their gold cost quite significantly from 50 to 65. I was looking at decreasing their damage reversibility, but it turns out I couldn't really do that without getting rid of it entirely, and I like the way that it works. So now they're just expensive and you can't get that many of them. They may still turn out to be too strong, but if you've been watching my Skaven game, you've seen that there's been some situations where Doomfire Warlocks in like a big mob were just impossible for anyone to deal with without taking, losing a huge amounts of gold. Even mages and things were dying when they attacked them. So that's been changed a bit. And then Malus Darkblade has lost Berserk because he's mounted. In Dominions, mounted things aren't allowed to have Berserk. So he had the Berserk tag, but it didn't do anything. So I took it off and I gave him some extra attack and protection. And this is a theme, I've done this in a few nations where they had mounted Berserk things. So moving on to the Dwarfs, we have the hero Ungrim. He had a bug where he kept getting the Mark of Drengi multiple times. That's fixed. The Dwarf Hero preview site wasn't showing them as commanders. So they didn't have their item slots and things like that displaying, but I fixed that. Rangers and Ranged Captains had a pointless ambidexterity because they don't have two-hand weapons, so I just got rid of that because it was distracting people. And then finally I made a tweak to the Rune of Valaya, and it was basically completely useless before. It cost 10 Astral Pearls, and it gave you Disease Healer and Self Healer, but the Dwarfs already have Priestesses of Valaya that are healers. They didn't need that at all. So now it gives you a little bit of regeneration, and it still gives you Self Healer, but it doesn't give you Disease Healer. But it's now half the price and half the path requirements that it was. So it's basically just the half the price thing that's the important thing for the dwarves. And you still get the rune shield that floats around you and helps you out if you've got that. So maybe that's now buildable. I hope so. Moving on to the Empire, we've got a fix. Firstly, the Gold Lion Grandmaster had a messed up map move. He was very slow and couldn't keep up with his own knights, so I fixed that. And then on the topic of knightly orders, they've all been significantly reduced in gold price. They're all around 25% cheaper generally. There were a few people that fed back that they felt that they were really a rip-off. The idea was that people might be able to use them. You save up some money and use them to have like an expansion party, a powerful expander, because they can circumnavigate having to have resources or recruitment point limits. You just turn gold into like a really strong force. There's not really losses, but basically they were just too expensive, and people weren't very happy with that and weren't really using them. And I want to be able to use them, and I want the people who do use them to feel that they're not getting ripped off, that they're getting value for money. I want everyone to be able to use the things they want to use and to use a variety of units and not feel that they're having to play suboptimally or feel bad about the fact they're not using some unit that's clearly better. That's a big thing in my mods. I decreased the hit points on Thyros Gorman a bit because it was a bit excessive. The Archlector of Sigmar is now a poor leader, not no leader, and there were quite a few. So I've mentioned here the Collared Wizards get a poor leader, so there are a few wizards that didn't have any leadership ability at all, so they couldn't take any bodyguards, and that was kind of annoying people. So I basically just took that off and gave them poor leader. It's not a big deal that they can lead some troops. They're still thematically and mechanically not the things that will be leading big armies around for you, so that's fine. Bright Wizards fire resistance were this was reduced a bit. It was at 25, which is like extremely supernaturally high fire resistance. 10 is more like I am a human being who is magically resistant to fire kind of levels, which is basically what Bright Wizards are. Amber Wizards now have some Beastmaster ability in case they want to lead some animals. That gives them morale bonus to any animals they lead. Amber Wizard Lords rather get Beastmaster and some changes to their leadership works. So they've now got they're not very good at leading humans, but they're pretty good at leading larger numbers of animals. And all of the Wizard Lord summons cost more gems now because it was just a bit too cheap previously, basically. So it's a little bit of a nerf to the nation as a whole. That to get your top tier mages, you need to spend more gems, but I think they were just too cheap before. It's too much of a bargain. You've already got really good magical ability because of your big magical diversity, so that's a little bit of a nerf to the Empire. The Knights of the Blazing Sun get an extra defense. That's not really very important, like a minor change, and their fire resistance was decreased a bit as well because it's this is back more into the same kind of thing. I don't want it to be so like you're completely immune to fire. It should be more like you are supernaturally resistant to fire, but you're still a human being. You're not like made out of fire like a fire elemental. So moving on to Greenskins. They have their flags tweaked. So basically, going from Dominions 4 to Dominions 5, the size of flags that you're allowed to have, the actual canvas size and resolution was changed. And you could use the old flags that were on a smaller canvas, and Dominions would automatically resize them, but it wasn't doing that for all of the menus. So I fixed that so that they do now have their flags all the proper size, but I haven't made use of the extra resolution yet, so they look a little bit blocky and pixely, but they still look fine. I've also given invulnerability to all of the forest goblins, just a little bit of invulnerability. It doesn't make a big difference. They've got a little bit more protection now against mundane attacks than they had previously, and it's more of a flavour thing really. But they weren't really favourably comparable with night goblins and ordinary goblins, who get, of course, the nasty skulkers who have those armor-piercing attacks. So now hopefully the forest goblins are people who are recruiting forest goblins will feel a bit happier about them being a little bit better. I also added a spell. There's not very much content in this update, but there's a few things. One of them is that I have added a spell so that Night Goblin Shamans can summon up. So this is for Greenskins North, they're the only one that get the Night Goblins. If you've got a cave province you control, you can put a lab there and summon up some cave squigs with a particular spell. And cave squigs are good fun. So hopefully people will be happy with that. Then we have changes to the High Elves. So this is, you can see it's a big block. This is a nation where I've spent a bit more time making changes. This is one of the focuses of this version. And many of the changes here are to do with basically making them a bit weaker. They needed a bit of a nerf, the High Elves. They were too strong. I think they potentially are still too strong because I didn't make really sweeping changes to the way their mages and magic works, and that's one of the things that made them really strong. But I've made a few changes that are nerfs, so let's just go through those. So firstly, a couple of fixes. Great Eagles now require air gems, not water gems. That was just a typo on my part, so that's fixed. And War Lions that were left over after Chariot of Crace was destroyed. Previously, because they would take the age from the Chariot of Crace's, elven drivers, and the War Lions had a much lower max age, they came out super old age and useless. So that's not the case anymore. I've just basically pushed up the maximum age on War Lions a bunch, so they're similar to Elves. This is a tweak that of the way that heroes work, which is how it works for all of the other nations. I think I've now moved them all onto the system, which is basically just that your unique heroes appear via events that can only happen once, and those have fixed percentages, and they're not to do with the luck scale, whereas multi-heroes are still to do with the luck scale. And they, because it's now using an event, they can come with some appropriate troops. So the High Elves only have two heroes. They have Alithanar, the Shadow King, who will turn up with some Shadow Warriors, and they have Core Hill, the captain of the White Lions, who will turn up with some White Lions and some War Lions of Crace. So that's been done, and of course you can see those in the preview sites. I reduced the coastal income bonus that they have from 25% to 15% because High Elves had too much gold before. They had a special start that mean that they would start on the coast, and that applies to their capital. So you can see, like, losing 10% of their capital, extra capital income they were getting, is going to make a fairly big difference to how strong the nation is. That's a fairly major nerf. The Chariot of Grace recruitment is limited to 2 per turn because I didn't want people making massive armies of just Chariots of Grace because they're relatively rare in the Warhammer world. So just rec limited those. And we'll see if I need to make any other changes. I made the flag bigger like I did for the Greenskins, but I also actually redid the flag to use the full resolution because I've got all these extra pixels I can use. So yeah, tweaked it a bit. And I think the flag looks pretty great now. Death Jester's design was already really good. Death Jester is the person who did all of the graphics for the High Elves originally in Dominions 3, I think it was, and Dominions 4, and then I've updated them for Dominions 5 and added some new graphics. Some of them are completely done by me, and the flag is me updating all of his graphics. The Archmage and the Lawmaster were added to the multi-hero pool, so previously the only multi-hero you could get was the Prince on the Great Eagle, and he could be pretty oppressive early on, and now you can get 2 of your really strong mages in there as well. So it adds a bit more variety to the multi-heroes, and it means that you're a bit less like, if you take high luck, you're not just getting tons of these eagle guys flying around that could be quite oppressive. The War Lions were limited to 10 recruits per turn. That was mostly because the AI would just build tons of them, which was annoying, so I've just limited those. I do the same thing with like dogs, war dogs that can be built by Middenheim and Chaos Hounds and things. I tend to put that recruitment limit on there to stop the AI building massive armies of just these like low resource troops. Dragon Prince and Prince of Kalador fire resistance decreased, same reasons as for the Empire, because I just want it to be like not like they're made out of fire or anything, they just have a supernatural resistance or an equipment-based resistance to fire. Core Hill lost his nature 1. I don't want him to be a mage, he can just be a war leader. He turns up with his own troops, so even if he's not like an amazing thug or anything, he still has his troops there, and it wasn't really appropriate him having Nature 1. That was something Death Jester did, and I understand why, but I've changed that. Alethanar has been almost completely redone. I changed his sprite quite a bit. It's not exactly what I would do, but if I were doing a completely new sprite for Alethanar, but I think he still looks good, and he looks more distinctive from the Shadow Warriors and their captains, the Shadow Walkers. I also made a new item for him, and I changed the way that he works. He's basically he's a bit more of a caster now than he was before, and he's an assassin now, and he's also got a pretty cool ranged attack and more sensible kind of item slots and things. He's pretty cool. I hope someone can have some good fun with Alethanar. The Eagle Claw Bolt Thrower, I also made a pretty big change to. This is a bit more than a tweak. So previously, I don't really like artillery in Dominions, in mods, and I don't really like artillery particularly that's stationary because I think it behaves weirdly on the battlefield. Like when you're routing or something like that, the crew would run away from the artillery. They wouldn't just be going like, "Oh, we have to slowly drag away this like massive bolt thrower." And I just didn't really like the way it behaved in Dominions, but I don't mind it so much when it's being pulled by something or it's mounted on a chariot. So that's what I decided to do. So I changed the Eagle Claw Bolt Thrower so it's now mounted on a chariot as a new sprite, and it doesn't fire a swarm of shots +1 big shot, but instead fires 4 medium shots every other round. So it's like having, or I say medium, they're really powerful armor-piercing shots, but it's like having 4 big arbalests strapped to a chariot, and then they'll fire every other round instead of every 3 rounds. Yeah, but people hopefully have fun with that one. Added some square bracketed info to the troops to remind people they have halved upkeep, because High Elves, all of their non-sacred troops have halved upkeep, just like the sacreds do. Mages which aren't military commander types no longer have hit point boosts. This was something that I was originally doing because Warhammer commanders have like multiple wounds, like with even wizards, not just military commanders. But basically, it just makes mages too good. They need to be more like Dominions mages, where they can be killed by things like earthquakes or blood rights and falling stones, global effects like that, or they can be killed by assassins more easily, or they can be killed by things like Seeking Arrow. And if you bump up their hit points, going like, oh, they have 3 wounds in the Warhammer tabletop game, so they should be a lot tougher than a regular human. Well, they just kind of break a bunch of things in the game, break Seeking Arrows and stuff like that. So I just took that away from the High Elves. I'd taken it away from all of the other nations pretty much already. I think they're all now, they don't have mages with tons of hit points unless they're like ogre mages. So I did that for the High Elves. They're now pretty fragile. I reduced the power of the Prince and the Great Eagle because I had some reports that it was pretty oppressive when people got it early, which they were doing because it was a multi-hero. So it has less unsurroundability, it lost its inspirational, and it had a big hit point reduction. The hit points were really high because it was supposed to represent that it's like when you're trying to kill the rider, the prince, you're also hitting the Great Eagle sometimes, so it's kind of a combined profile. But you still have to kill the prince, and then the Great Eagle is still there and fights a bit before it flies off at the end of the battle. But I instead decided to just put the hit points down to basically just be the prince's hit points with like a tiny bit extra. But he did get a bit of helmets to compensate for some of these changes. Doesn't make a big difference. The main thing is just this hit point reduction makes him a bit more feasible to kill early on. All of the mages were made basically worse at leading troops because they were all a little bit too good previously, and it's not really thematic. High elf mages don't really lead armies and things. They leave that to the nobility and the generals and princes and things like that. Although some of the mages are nobility, they're not really war leaders. They're more like they'll go along with armies to do things using their magical powers. But they're more kind of scholars than Parathoi mages, which are your cheapest mage and they're your most efficient research mage. They cost the same in terms of gold. They have all the same stats and abilities as previously, except they've lost the extra hit points and things. But they're no longer sacred, so they don't have that halved upkeep anymore. It does mean that you don't need a temple to recruit them. Previously, you had to make a lab and a temple to get them, so you do get to keep some gold that way, but all of the other mages are still sacred, so you will need a temple to get those. But yeah, they're not sacred. You don't have the halved upkeep on the Harathoi, so you now don't have quite as good research per gold points, although they are still the best in that ratio gold to research, and High Elves still should have really good research. I reduced the damage on the Flames of Phoenix cloud effect. So these are all spell changes. Basically, Flames of the Phoenix does less damage. They no longer have Dispel because they've got a national version of Dispel called Sigil of Azuren, and I just took out Dispel so you don't end up casting that because Sigil of Azuren is strictly better and doesn't require any research. I removed one of the projectiles from Fury of Cain to make it a bit worse. Shield of Safri is slightly higher research level to make it a bit worse. I removed the Apotheosis spell because I don't like it at all. It was basically like it heals and blesses things, but the AI couldn't really cope with it properly and it was causing some problems, so I just took it out. And I reduced the number of effects and damage of Soul Quench a bit because Soul Quench is a bit too strong. And then I've also added research requirements to Grey Eagles and Unicorns, which were summon spells which required no research whatsoever previously. And I also increased the cost of summoning the Eagles a bit because they're a bit too cheap. Finally, we've got some things that aren't nerfs to them, but are actually discounts they get to some troops that weren't getting built very much because they were too expensive. The Silver and Guard are cheaper in gold cost, 25 goes down to 22. The Shadow Warrior goes from 30 gold to 25 gold, and the War Lion of Krace is reduced from 30 gold to 25 gold. These were basically just a bit overpriced, I think. So I've knocked those down, and hopefully people will build them a bit more now. That's everything for the High Elves. Now let's have a look at the Lizardmen. So only a small number of changes to them. I fixed the Ancient Halberd, which was had the wrong length, and this is the biggest fix to them. The Obstinate Spear, which was a basic weapon used by one of the two like basic recruitable Sauruses, it had way too much damage. It had the damage of like a glaive or halberd. It's gone down from 9 to 4. That was just a typo on my part, but it was making one of the Sauruses obviously better than the other one, and now it should be a more sensible choice, and also it makes the nation a bit less strong overall because the spear was just too good. I also made the Obstinate Sword and Axe slightly increase in resource cost because it gives you a bit more of a choice between the spear armed things and the Obstinate Sword and Axe armed things. And then I also nerfed the Sacred Spawnings a bit in that they all have about 4 extra gem cost on all of them, which is about 25% of their overall cost. The Sacred Spawnings are just ones where you get like 12 Sacred Saurus of a particular Lizardman god, one of the old ones, and you get a leader to lead them. And in the Skaven game, if you've been watching that recently, the lizards basically had armies entirely made out of these sacred summons because they don't cost upkeep, because you can get a lot of them because they're all sacred, so that you can make the use of a big bless. So yeah, it just made them more expensive. They were too good, too undercosted previously. So moving on to the Ogre Kingdoms. The Man-Eater Northern Sprite was missing. I think people had been manually fixing this, or maybe I'd fixed the version that was uploaded, but not the version that was on my computer. I'm not sure, but this would have made the ogres not work at all as soon as the Man-Eater, the Northern Man-Eater appeared, so I had to fix that. That was important. I discounted the Gorger in terms of his gold cost a bit. We'll talk about their cost in Turmoil 3 because that's basically when you should be recruiting them, not their much more expensive cost outside of Turmoil 3. He went from 50 to 45. The Slave Giant went from 225 down to 200, so a cheaper Slave Giant, because they weren't really being built, they weren't very attractive. So hopefully that makes them a bit more attractive. The Chaos Dwarf one, had the similar change as well. People are just not really liking giants too much. The Henchfiend was increasing cost. So these are all a bunch of nerfs here to the Ogre Kingdoms, and that's partly based on General Confusion's recent video where he did a single player game as the Ogre Kingdoms and noticed something which I already believed to be true, which is basically a lot of these things are too aggressively costed. It's too cheap to make up for shortcomings of the nation. And the nation over time has gotten stronger, and it doesn't need this big boost in these very, very cheap things in its blood economy anymore. So Henchfiends are now 22 slaves instead of 16. Morphines are 66 instead of 40. They were very, very cheap. The More Tribe Summon has moved from 28 slaves to 33, and the number is reduced from 8 of them to 7 of them. I think that's still kind of a bargain, and maybe it's still too good. We can always, come back and review these, but that should make them a little bit less oppressive. And the Yeti Shaman cost was increased from 16 nature gems to 20 nature gems. I also made a small change to the Tyrant Plate, which is used by the Tyrants, and it's also used by the Ogre Pit Fighters, who are their really strong sacred, and just decreased the protection down from 15 to 14, which is the same as a Plate Cuirass. And yeah, it makes the Pit Fighter slightly worse, and the Tyrant slightly worse as well. Increased the damage on the Scrap Barrage slightly because no one was making use of the Scrap Thrower, and maybe the Scrap Thrower is still not useful, but that's a slight boost to it because they have a lot of projectiles, so an extra damage is actually quite a big deal to them. And then I added one extra spell, a new bit of content there. Bone Crusher spell is basically an ogre version of Maws of the Earth. You use a blood slave and pay a bunch of fatigue, and you make Maws of the Earth happen. So the enemy gets chomped by the earth and gets stuck in the mud. And it's very thematically appropriate for them. It's this maw opening up in the ground and biting people. Then we have the Skaven. The Cauldron of a Thousand Boxes lost Berserk because it's mounted, and it got its poison resistance increased. This is based on my experience in games recently. I don't think that a thing that is producing a foul vapors and has a big poison cloud should really be constantly poisoning itself. That seemed weird. Or it should be poisoning itself rarely. So I put its poison resistance up from 10 to 15. You will notice that I also put the cost up. I've listed this a bit later. The Cauldron of a Thousand Boxes was increased in cost from 77 slaves to 99 slaves, so a fairly significant cost increase because having an automatic foul vapors right at the start of combat is really strong. That may just turn out to still be too strong, and maybe I have to push up the research that you have to do to get it, or push up the cost even more. But for now, that's a kind of a nerf to those. Plague rats now have a sprite that's a bit more recognizable, so you can tell them apart from regular giant rats more easily. And it was fun to draw that. It's got all kind of flies and things buzzing around it. And the spell to summon plague rats was increased in cost a lot, from 8 to 18, and the research level was increased from 3 to 5. That's because the spell was just too strong before, and because plague is such a nasty effect, if you get it really early on in an early war, when the enemy using its big armies of mundane troops, they can be completely devastated by it. Also, the number of rats was decreased from 10 to 6. So previously, you were spending 8 slaves and getting 10 rats, and now you're spending 18 slaves and getting 6 rats. So a significant nerf to that because it was way too strong before. If you've been watching the Skaven game, I used it once in a battle against the Orcs when, okay, I just spent I think it was one casting of it, so it was like 8 of these rats, and I killed like 80 fairly decent orc troops with it. It just rampaged through one of their armies, the plague, and it was no commitment whatsoever for me. It was 8 slaves, so way too good. And now I would have to spend more like 18 twice to get the kind of similar number of rats and maybe get the same effect, which is much more reasonable. Rat ogres were a little bit underpowered, I felt, and maybe they still are, but I gave them 1 extra morale and 1 extra natural protection because these are both kind of thematically justifiable buffs to them. And it should mean that they get repelled a little bit less as well, having that morale. And then Warp Static is now magic resistance negates on the charged body effect. That's partly because I want to make the AI mages cast it on the right thing. They were casting it not on the hordes of chaff in front of them, but on other stuff. And now the chaff having lower magic resistance should be a more tempting target for Warp Static. It also makes Warp Static a bit less of a method of just getting tons of things that have charged body. And I put a different explosion sprite on it and increased the range a bit. The explosion sprite is just so that you can actually see what's happening a bit more easily, what things have been hit by the warp static, and the range increase is because the spell actually sort of has a projectile now, so it takes a little bit of time to travel, which means that increasing the range helps them cast it on the right thing and not completely miss. Then we've got some changes to Slaanesh. The Marauder Horseman and Horsemaster were size 2. This is why they were so effective in the Skaven game, and I think RCK made a video on Slaanesh recently, and he mentioned how really good the Marauder Horsemen were, and it's because they were at size 2. Size 2 is way too good for cavalry. It was completely a typo on my part. They were supposed to be size 3. There was also a similar problem where I had the wrong. Sorry, problem with the headset there. I was saying there was a similar problem where I had the wrong encumbrance on sorcerers, sorcerer lords, and cultists. They had encumbrance 10, and they were supposed to have encumbrance 3. So I fixed that. A couple of fixes there. And there was also a problem where some of the spawn weren't switching to the first shapes correctly. This was a really minor fix, and it was just for cosmetic reasons, but that's now fixed. Finally, the Wicked Claw weapon that was used on Demon Princes and Keepers of Secrets was one that would disappear if you gave them weapons, which you definitely would want to do because they can act like super combatants or thugs, and they shouldn't be losing their claws. They should usually use their claws and their human-like hands at the same time. So then now a bonus weapon, so that doesn't happen. So you get to hit things with claws and give them 2 firebrands, whatever crazy thing you want to do with them. And then finally, everything gets cold res 3 at least. There were a bunch of things for Slaanesh that didn't get cold res, and it was just a bit weird because they live up in the frozen north basically. So I just gave everything cold res 3, a bit like Buggerus in the base game. So moving on to Tilea. I've got some fixes. The Sartosan Pirate was using 2 weapons, 1 in each hand. He didn't have ambidexterity. That's now fixed. He does. The Manflayer Corsair actually had a sprite that was pointing to their leader, so they all looked like the leader of that mercenary group, which was weird. So I fixed that, and they've got the correct sprite now. And the national description was falsely claiming that they liked Heat 1, when in fact they liked neutral heat scales. So I just made that fix that typo. Then I have a small nerf here. The Dwarf Warrior is now rec limited to 5, and its resource cost is slightly higher because people were up basically building armies of Dwarf Warriors for Tilea, which I didn't want to be happening. They're supposed to just be like a small mercenary contingent. They just don't have the large population of Dwarf Warrior mercenaries out there, so they're now rec limited. The College Wizards get Poor Leader. The College Wizards were brought in line with the Empire ones, basically. So all the changes I made to the Empire ones also applied to the Tylean like mercenary College Wizards. And yeah, they also had their hit point values reduced, a bit like the Elven ones. So they had the older version of the Empire Wizards that had higher hit points, and they've just been normalized with all the other standard Empire ones. But they do cost more money because Tylea is hiring them as mercenaries. Speaking of mercenaries, the mercenary contract has been reduced in gold cost from 380 to 340. People were saying that it wasn't really worth it as a deal. This is very similar to the knightly orders. Maybe it's still not worth it as a deal, but that should make it a bit more attractive, the fact that it's a little bit less gold. And the privateer captain had too much gold upkeep previously. He is more expensive in terms of gold to buy because he comes with a bunch of free troops, but then you don't want to keep paying the expensive upkeep on the privateer captain because you have to pay the upkeep on the troops as well. So it's just to make a bit more sense. Just 2 nations left now, the Tomb Kings and the Vampires. So the Tomb Kings got a fairly significant set of nerfs. They're a bit like the High Elves in that I knew that they were too strong and I wanted to just tone them down and also make some quality of life improvements. So the quality of life improvements at the front is that the Tomb Herald, Tomb Prince had their Dominion requirements pushed down. That's just so that you can get them going earlier so they can lead your armies and so on without you having to sit just pumping up your Dominion in your capital until you can actually have some military leaders. The Tomb Prince and Tomb King immortality is a bit quicker. So they had really long respawn times, like 12 months respawn time is almost like I don't care that you're immortal because maybe the war is going to be over or I'm going to be dead by the time you're actually ready to respawn. So I just pushed those down so it makes more of a difference. Previously it was 12 for the Tomb Prince, now it's 9. Previously it was 6 months for the Tomb King, now it's 5. The Tomb Herald, because he is a skeletal leader and not really a mummy, he's not mummified, is now a poor amphibian, so he can go on water and lead your skeletons around. So the Tomb Kings are actually okay at taking underwater now by using Tomb Heralds to go underwater, and they now require no upkeep because they're not kind of intelligent commanders in the same way as some of the others. They're just kind of these, they're not mindless, but they don't require like any luxuries or anything like any of the others. They don't have any upkeep on them. And then I have made, this is pretty sweeping changes, that the basic undead soldiers, Tomb Guard, etc., just are made more expensive in gold. I'm not going to go through all the gold changes there, but it's quite a bit because basically everything the Tomb Kings had, more or less, was undercosted. Their commanders were okay, but their troops were pretty much undercosted. And it's partly because I wasn't taking into account that because you don't have to pay any upkeep, you really do have a lot of gold to throw at these troops, and a lot of their natural abilities from being undead, which are normally, counterweighted by the disadvantages of being undead, like you can be banished and things. Well, the Tomb Kings are quite hard to banish because of their higher magic resistance. So I should really have just been costing them higher from the start, and I have now pushed their gold costs up. The same is true of the statues. They're more expensive gold, and they've also had their hit points slightly decreased across the board. They're very tough, but they're a little bit more fragile now. They're still pretty tough in terms of hit points, but really it's their kind of protection and things that keep them safe, not their hit points. Shabti are also now a Montag recruit. So when you buy an Ashabti, you get one of the 3 random each time. So if you buy 4 Ashabti, each of those 4 Ashabti could be one of the 3 different types. That's dual swords one, a 2-handed weapon one, and a one with a big bow. So you get more random Ashabti. Otherwise, people were basically just buying the one Ashabti that was the right one for their matchup, which was usually the dual weapons one, and they were just buying big, homogeneous blocks of that, which was less interesting. The Hierotitan and the Necrolith Colossus are both summons, and they now have increased research, so you can you have to research a little bit more to get to those summons. And the Hierotitan is no longer a troop; he's now a commander, but he doesn't have very good miss slots, just 2 miss slots and a crown. and his gem cross was increased because of that. So yeah, Hydro Titans are commanders now. I don't remember why I decided that they should be troops. I think maybe it was to do with their the fact that they're just kind of these missile unit guys and wanted people to be leading them. But I think they make more sense as commanders. Various commander gold costs were tweaked, and the Necrotect in particular was made a bit more expensive. Necrotects were basically just a bit too good previously, and you would just want to have loads of them. So now you don't have quite so many of those, and you're going to have a bit more diversity amongst the mages, I'm hoping. The Tomb Swarm spells were both decreased in number of effects because they were just too strong before. Too strong, basically their national version of a kind of skelly spam spell where they're just swarming over the battlefield. But the Greater Tomb Swarm had a holy requirement of 3 previously, which basically meant that only your prophet could cast it because your high priest and things aren't actually holy 3, and it needs holy 3 and death 3. So yeah, so a normal leash priest would need a booster to do it, but yeah, basically just people couldn't cast it before. Now they can, so that was a bit of a weird thing. That's almost like a fix, that tweak. The Undying Chant, which is the one that gives them regeneration, was decreased in area effect significantly and reduced range because it was a bit too strong previously. The Chant of Might has reduced range, and the Necrotect Mantra also has reduced range. Necrotect Mantra is the regeneration for the non-undead stuff, the statues and things, so it's particularly strong, and now only affects a single target rather than having AoE 1, which makes it harder to land, and you can't use it to hit 2 Shabti at once, and it's got lower range. This may still be too strong because you can use it on Tomb Scorpions and things that these big single targets, and the Hyro Titan, stuff like that, but I'm hoping that it's okay now. I guess we'll see. But the Necrotect's the only thing that can cast it, and they're more expensive now, so maybe that makes a difference. Unleash the Stalkers had its research level increased by 1 as well, because Stalkers are really strong. And then finally, we've got the Vampires. This is the very last set of things to talk about. First, I've got a fix, which is the Blood Dragon preview sites now correctly say that the Blood Knights are cap only. I just made a mistake with that previously, so a minor correction there. And then they had a bunch of cavalry that, mounted units that had Berserk, but of course Berserk doesn't work if you're mounted, so I took it off, and they got some extra attack and protection to compensate. I reduced the gold cost of the Blood Drake, which is the kind of lower tier Blood Dragon lineage vampire commander, who was just a bit overpriced previously. On the Carstein front, the peasant and levy troops are now slaves. They have halved upkeep. I felt like people were going for the undead options way more than they were going for the peasant and levies, so they are now halved upkeep, which maybe makes them a bit more attractive. Going back to Bloodlines, I'm jumping around a bit here, but this is just how I've written out, because these are kind of just done in the order that I did them, basically. The young Blood Knights that you can get from promotions from aspirants, from Bretonian and Imperial aspirants, now have brown horses and slightly different graphics to help differentiate them from the older Blood Knights, and they are now almost living. And the reason for this is that people in the Discord helped me discover that basically, if you had full undead leadership or didn't have any undead leadership, and you were leading a bunch of Bretonian aspirants or Imperial aspirants around, when they got promoted and turned into vampires, they required undead leadership. And for some reason, that made the game go, well, there is no undead leadership, so I'm just going to make all these things disappear. So yeah, they were just vanishing, which is really bad because you've gone all through all of that trouble to get them promoted. Then them disappearing is a significant loss of resources, and yeah, really bad. So that's fixed. They're now almost living, which means that they don't require undead leadership. They just require normal leadership, and now they won't vanish if they get promoted under any circumstances, as far as I can tell. I made some minor changes to the way that the promotions work, so that it now uses the kind of Slaanesh method, which relies on homesickness, which is a bit weird, but it's I say specifically how it works in the descriptions of the units, so it should be fairly straightforward to understand. The Bretonian aspirants got a bit better because they were a little bit, I think, overpriced before, but they've now got the proper Breton lance and the proper Destria hoof that the Bretonian knights have because they are Bretonian knights. And yeah, that's partly for flavour reasons and partly just because those things are better, which justifies their cost a bit more. And I made the Blood Dragon capital only site the Legacy of Abharash. Give a little bit less experience when you train there. It was giving 5 previously for each unit every turn that you trained there, and now it's only giving 4, so it's a little bit less strong to just sit at home training your aspirants to turn into young Blood Knights. And then this really is a great many changes to gold costs and death scale discounts to all of the undead stuff. So now, generally, true undead for the vampires have about a 50% discount, so they are half price in Death 3 as they would be in neutral growth or growth 1 or growth 2 or growth 3. And vampires have a bit less of a discount, so there's a little bit less incentive to have death if you're using vampires, and Servants of the Undead have even less than that, and some of them have no death discount at all because they're kind of they're fully living in like the land of the living. They're not a product of death magic or a death dominion at all. Like I'm thinking of like the sergeants and men at arms and things that serve the Blood Knights. They're completely happy to live in the land of the living. They don't want to turn the world into the realm of the dead. They're just loyal to their lords who happen to be vampires. But yeah, so some thematic differences there, and I think vampire players may now need to think quite carefully about what level of death they're going to take, depending on what bloodlines they're using. If you're using the Blood Dragon lineage primarily, maybe you don't want to have such high death. Maybe you want to actually take growth, possibly, or Larmians also have some of those guys that aren't discounted. If you're going to go Karstein or Necrarch or Strigoi, I think you're much more likely to want to take a higher amount of death to get and use the stuff that has a high death discount. So just making an already complicated nation even more complicated, but still, hopefully people have fun with that, and it encourages some people to take Death 3, which is a difficult thing to do, even if it's thematic, because it's just kind of a bad scale in Dominions. All of the monsters now explicitly tell you what their gold cost is if you're in Death 3 scales, in addition to their normal gold cost, which can help people make decisions about whether they want to take high death or whether they want to recruit them in Death 3 and so on. True Strigoi were a bit too good, so I reduced their protection and hit points a little bit. They may still be too good. I guess we'll keep an eye on True Strigoi. I was hearing that they were really, really strong previously. The Humanist High Priest and Humanist Priest, which are in the Larmian bloodline, got their gold cost decreased by quite a bit, 10 each. They were basically just a little bit overpriced. The mercenary troops used by the Larmian bloodline are now more like the mercenary troops hired by Tilea, in that they were basically overpriced previously. I've reduced their cost a bit, but they now do cost a bit more in the resources. They had like literally zero resource cost previously, but now they do cost some resources, but they are a little bit better in quality and they have a lower gold cost. So hopefully a bit more useful in the Larmian bloodline now. And just generally they're more in line with the Tylean ones. The Skeleton Warrior spells now give a bit more for free each time you move up a tier. So as you move up to the higher ones, you get more of a bulk bonus, a bulk extra benefit from casting these spells. And then I've added 2 new bits of content. One of them is just a new spell, which is called Prolong the Cattle, and it's basically a national blood fecundity which doesn't require nature. So blood fecundity is a blood ritual, it's blood nature, and it increases your growth scale towards by 2 points. So if you're Death 3, it can increase it up to Death 1, and if you were like Growth 0, it could increase it to Growth 3 and Growth 2, and so on. But it required blood nature, which is something they do have on some of their mages. They can do that, but it's a bit harder for the vampires. So I made it just blood, so that if you're using the other lineages that don't really have the nature, because Karsteins have nature, and I think Strigoi have nature, but Larmians and Necrarchs and Blood Dragons don't. And they now, at least with boosters, can cast Prolong the Cattle, which is basically a way of mitigating taking death. So it's another little bit more inducement to take death scales, and then think about what you're going to do to have some provinces not have so much death if where you're blood hunting and so on. And then finally, the most major bit of content, it's kind of really small in terms of the impact it'll have on the game, but I really had fun doing it, was I added Manfred von Karstein, the Dark Master of Drakenhof, as a hero. And he's available no matter what bloodlines you pick. He's just got the same kind of event chance of turning up in your capital as other heroes for other nations. But yeah, Manfred von Karstein, he's probably the second most famous out of all the vampire characters after Vlad von Karstein. And he's good fun, and I really like the sprite for him. And I think I will put the sprite for him as the thumbnail or cover image for this video. So that's everything for the changelog. I'm probably going to do one of these videos every time I do like a big new version of the Warhammer compilation pack. I hope that you go and give it a try. You can see I'm always looking at things. I'm always trying to like get things more sensibly balanced, and I'm always trying to improve people's experience of playing the mod. You can see lots of changes across lots of nations this time. So yeah, give it a go, and I will see you in future videos. Bye for now.